Welcome to today's lecture. Today we're going to be going over government surveillance and whistleblowing, and we're going to be applying two ethical frameworks to these topics and cases that we're going to discuss, and those are egoism and utilitarianism. I'm Gavin Ingalls, and we're going to have Owen and Ben lecturing today as well. So what is government surveillance? So most modern developed countries these days have governments that will conduct some kind of surveillance on either their own citizens or foreign citizens or both. And that can come in the form of monitoring calls or internet usage or other forms of communication. In our case, we're going to mostly be discussing the US's role in government surveillance. We're going to go over some of the changes to government surveillance in the US after 9/11 and its intended use, which was to stop terrorism. And we're going to discuss two key pieces of legislation, which are the Patriot Act and FISA. So the Patriot Act was in large part a response to the September 11th attacks on the U.S. on the Twin Towers. It was passed shortly after those attacks with mostly bipartisan support, and the original intent of the act was to expand the government's ability to surveil, investigate, and detain suspected terrorists, both domestically and internationally. So the three main provisions of the Patriot Act are to expand the abilities of law enforcement and government agencies to surveil citizens and agents they deem to be suspect of committing crimes. That can come in the form of tapping forms or monitoring other electronic communication. It also eases the ability for government agencies to communicate with one another and makes it easier for the sharing of intelligence resources between, say, the CIA and FBI. Before this act, that may have been more difficult. There may have been more red tape involved. And the third main provision is an increase in penalties for crimes that qualify as terrorism, and also expanding the list of crimes that qualify as terrorism. So the major changes related to the privacy of telephonic and electronic communication that we know of today are in large part due to the Patriot Act. One of these main changes came in amending the Wiretap Act of 1968. Interestingly enough, this act was originally passed to prohibit the government from eavesdropping on private communications without a court order. So in the past, there had to be some sort of process for obtaining an order to monitor private communications. But with this amendment, the Patriot Act eased those limitations of the government to gain access to monitoring private communications. There are also other changes in policy, especially with respect to immigration. The U.S. can now, if they deem someone of having ties to terrorism, they can deport, detain, or deny that individual admittance from the U.S. The Patriot Act also addressed some other issues related to crimes that could be tied to terrorism, such as money laundering. And as we stated earlier, it also eased interagency communication. So FISA and FISC is what we're going to discuss now. So FISA stands for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and FISC stands for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. So FISA grants authorization to the government to target foreign powers or their agents with electronic surveillance. One interesting aspect of this act is that the government just has to state that one purpose of the surveillance that they're conducting, so just a purpose of the surveillance being conducted is to collect foreign intelligence. It doesn't have to be the purpose. So this surveillance just has to say, oh, okay, yeah, like we are going to surveil this people, and it's partially due to collecting foreign intelligence, but it doesn't have to be the whole story. There could be other reasons for using the FISA Act to surveil on an individual. So FISC is the court that oversees requests for these warrants that grant authority to the government to electronically surveil anyone suspected of terrorism or being a foreign spy within the U.S. This is going to go hand in hand with our whistleblowing section, but before we get there, we can briefly discuss here about Edward Snowden and how his case was affected by FISA and FISC. So he was able to obtain a top secret order that was issued by FISC. And that order required a subsidiary of Verizon to provide an ongoing feed of all call detail records, which includes domestic calls, to the NSA. And so in our discussion on whistleblowing, we're going to look at this case a little bit more closely and discuss some of the ramifications. Okay, so now we're going to do the first section of our quiz. The quiz today is going to be due at the end of lecture. Since this is a pre-recorded lecture, we're going to assume that you pause here, or at least after I finish discussing these questions, and begin to answer them on your own. At the end of the lecture, one compiled document of each of the quiz questions you'll see throughout the lecture will be due. So these questions, we're just asking that you provide personal opinions, since we haven't quite gotten to the ethical frameworks yet. So number one, with the material just presented to you and with your own knowledge of current events about government surveillance, where do you draw the line on what the government should and should not be allowed to do? Number two, do you think it is legal or moral, in your own opinion, to spy on domestic phone calls in the US for the purpose of gathering intelligence? So basically, do you think, with question three, kind of goes hand in hand, we assume your answers will be very similar, but do you think the ends justify the means? Is it acceptable for us to say, yes, the US can monitor domestic communications for the purpose of stopping terrorist operations? So I'm going to pause here for 5 seconds and assume you're pausing the video and working on these questions, and we'll pick back up with whistleblowing. Okay, assuming you finished these questions, let's move on to whistleblowing and Edward Snowden. We'll also be discussing one other whistleblower. So what is whistleblowing? Whistleblowing is when an individual, without authorization, reveals private or classified information about an organization. And this information is usually related to some sort of wrongdoing or misconduct. The very notable whistleblower, at least in our times, is Edward Snowden, and he revealed some of the U.S. government's operations to spy on its own citizens. He released some classified information about NSA programs, as we mentioned earlier, that monitored domestic phone calls and phone call records. And he eventually was charged. We'll discuss that in the next slide, but he eventually was charged with some crimes and defected to Russia. Whistleblowing in general is pretty controversial. It toes that line between are you protecting private citizens and individuals by releasing this information, or are you potentially harming them because the information that you are revealing is secret for a reason, maybe. So Edward Snowden began his career with the CIA. He actually worked for the University of Maryland as a graduate student. I believe he was a graduate student or undergraduate, but he worked in a lab at the University of Maryland that dealt with some classified information and worked with the CIA. He was able to obtain his security clearances and joined the CIA shortly after he finished there. In 2013, when this whistleblowing incident occurred, he was employed by the CIA, but was, of course, still able to access NSA records and was working with them as well. So what he did was he copied and leaked some classified information from the NSA about global surveillance operations, which included surveillance on U.S. citizens. He was eventually charged by the U.S. Department of Justice with violating the Espionage Act and stealing government property. Another whistleblower we're going to discuss here is Antoine Deltour. So he was the main whistleblower behind LuxLeaks, which was a big leak of tax documents, which showed how some companies violated these, or at least took advantage of tax rules. He was an employee of PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and he actually leaked 28,000 pages of these documents that showed how some multinational companies routed funds to lower their corporate tax bills. So it showed how these companies were able to skirt corporate tax laws by routing funds to, say, shell companies or whatnot. So he was initially charged by the Luxembourg prosecutor's office for this leak, but he actually had some great public support from both his home country of France and some other international countries. And with this support, he was able to appeal his case, and he ended up getting his sentence down to 6 months of prison time and a fine. Generally, the public supported Deltour. He went on to receive the European Citizens Award in 2015 and was named Person of the Year 2015 by Tax Notes International. And this will come up on the quiz, which I believe is on the next slide, but it's important to note the distinction in the reactions between Del Torre's case and Snowden's case. One being, in Snowden's case, fleeing the country to Russia because support was just not there for him. Whereas in the case of Del Torre, he had so much support that he was able to even reduce his sentence and even win some accolades. So this is the next section of our quiz here. Some questions about whistleblowing in these two cases. So like with the first set of questions, I'll run through them real quick and then pause for 5 seconds, assuming you've paused the video to fill out this part of your quiz, which again is to be submitted by the end of lecture. So number 1, Edward Snowden has been called a patriot, a traitor, a hero, a dissident, etc. What do you call him and why? So we just want to hear from you, your opinions on Edward Snowden's actions. Do you think he had the right to steal government property and release this information to the public, or do you think he was truly a traitor and criminal for his actions? Number 2, do you place any fault on the telecommunications companies such as Verizon who cooperated in providing government information to governments? So again, like we were discussing with the Snowden case, that issue, that FISC order that was issued was actually a requirement for Verizon a subsidiary of Verizon to hand over call records of domestic and international phone calls to the U.S. government. So do you think that Verizon is culpable at all in this situation? Or do you think that they are at the whims of the government and have to comply with such an order? Number 3, why do you think the public scrutiny of Snowden's case has been a mix of positive and negative reaction, with many reactions being negative, while the general reaction to Del Torre's case was positive, and with him even receiving some accolades for his whistleblowing? So, as I mentioned earlier, try to flesh out some of the differences in these cases. One main one I can think of is one involved a government and government secrets, whereas another involved a corporation. That could come into play in your response here. But okay, I'm going to again pause for 5 seconds, assuming you pause the video and fill out these questions. Okay. Assuming you've finished this section of the quiz, let's move on to egoism, which will be led by our next lecturer, Ben. And make sure to keep in mind all these cases we've discussed here and the acts and information presented, and attempt to apply the frameworks you're about to learn about to these topics and cases.
Hello, everybody. This is Owen. I will be presenting egoism. And I just want to say thank you to Gavin for the introduction and giving us some background on whistleblowing and government surveillance. So first, we're going to be looking at the background of ethical egoism in historical context. So, big picture, ethical egoism holds that actions whose consequences will benefit the doer are ethical. This is in contrast to utilitarianism, which Ben will present later, which holds that moral agents should treat oneself with no higher regard than one has for others. But as I said, Ben will dive deeper into that, but it's just an interesting comparison. We are looking at the two extremes here. So looking at the historical background and how this got developed, it is commonly held that it was introduced by philosopher Henry Sedgwick in his book, The Methods of Ethics, published in 1874. Sedgwick compared egoism, again, to the philosophy of utilitarianism, writing that whereas utilitarianism sought to maximize overall pleasure, egoism focused on maximizing individual pleasure. Although Sedgwick is seen as the first to introduce it, egoism has been seen throughout history. So we see Yang Zhu in 4th century BC, and his views, excuse this pronunciation, is "we wo," or everything for myself, as the only virtue necessary for self-cultivation. And then, of course, we see in ancient Greek, we see Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics. where they did not accept the formal principle that whatever the good is, we should seek only our own good or prefer it to the goods of others. So this is the historical background. This is where we see it throughout time. This is not anything new by any means. This idea of looking out for yourself above others is something that's been around for a while. Now we can see some of the justifications, because some people can claim that egoism is inherently selfish, but philosopher James Rachels, in his essay that takes the same title as the theory's name, egoism, outlines that three arguments most commonly touted in its favor. We're going to explore the first one, which is the most compelling. In this argument, it says each of us know what our individual wants and needs are. Therefore, we can pursue those wants and needs effectively. By this, what he's trying to say, or what he is saying, excuse me, is that it, in any other ethical framework, we have to assume the wants and needs of others. So for egoism, it is more natural because you know what you want and what you need, and so you're able to more effectively go after that because you know wholeheartedly and truthfully what is wanted and needed through this ethical framework. We also see R. Rand, and his justification for it is that if you act altruistically, it denies individuals' values. He has a great quote that says, if a man accepts the ethics of altruism, his first concern is not how to live, but how to sacrifice his life. I butchered that a little bit, but it's still there. This idea of denying altruism is very important for egoism. It's not a denial of altruism, but understanding that we as humans need to live our lives, and living our lives is looking out for number one, either as an individual or as a corporation or as a government. Your first concern should be to make sure that you are thriving. So now let's look at egoism when discussed with whistleblowing. So as Gavin did a great job of giving the background of whistleblowing, we're just going to dive into how egoism sees it. So there are two main parties in whistleblowing. You have the government and the citizens. For this lecture, we're going to focus on government whistleblowing, not on private company whistleblowings, although we will have you discuss that a little bit in breakout groups later on. Excuse me. This is pretty straightforward for egoism, because for the government, clearly, if the government is looking out what is best for them, whistleblowing is terrible because they are keeping these secrets for a reason. Whether that reason be national security or, making sure the public is, settled, or honestly, if they're doing something wrong, you know, and we'll get into government surveillance later and if we think that is right or wrong, but let's say they are doing, they're holding prisoners at black sites and they are torturing them for information, for example. Let's say that that's some of the secrets that they have. They clearly do not want those to go out. And so if they're looking out for self-surveillance, ideally that would never go out into the world. The second party is citizens. When it comes to citizens, it is a pro for in the eyes of egoism, because having this knowledge of what the government is doing is good for the individual so they can adjust their lives if they want to for themselves. Egoists thrive on knowledge because they want to know what is happening in a situation so they can deem for themselves what is the best course of action so that they can pursue their wants and needs most effectively. Next, we'll look at government surveillance. A government that only looks out for themselves, aka an egoist, would be heavily in favor of government surveillance because it is what is best for the government. It is best to have data on everyone to understand, for example, when a terrorist attack is coming or any threat like that. This also allows us to gather intel on foreign nations and helps us further prevent terrorist attacks or to help us in a war effort or in our economy or in any way. Again, as going back to whistleblowing, for an egoist individual, having knowledge is power. And for the government surveillance gives them knowledge, which allows them to act in accordance which is best in line with their wants and needs. Now, going on to an egoist civilian. This gets a little more complicated because one could claim that they are against it because the government having data on them does not directly help them, so therefore they won't support it. What this means is that if the government has their data, how does that benefit them? Because again, their only goal is to how they can benefit themselves. For example, let's say the government paid them for the data, then they would be for it because they get something out of it. Let's just say that's a large hypothetical, but you can see that line of reasoning where if they get something out of it, they might be more in favor of it. On the flip side of that, you could say that maybe the egoists are in favor for it because they have this prevention of terrorist attacks. Maybe it's not a tangible thing. However, that security that they get, because it doesn't affect them personally, but it affects the nation, and therefore living in a safe nation affects them. And so there's a lot to think about there, and that's something what we'll think about in our discussion questions. Our discussion question is, when it comes to whistleblowing, is there any information that can be leaked that actively hurts citizens and thus would be bad for an egoist? Also, I would like you to talk about, does your views on government surveillance as an egoist change when it is only foreign versus foreign and domestic surveillance? How do these benefit civilians? How does it hurt them? I'm going to be quiet now and let you guys go into breakout rooms and answer these questions for yourselves. Welcome back. Now that you have finished that portion of the quiz, Ben is going to talk about utilitarianism. Thank you. Take it away, Ben.